We have breaking news out of Washington. The House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol is subpoenaing 4 Republican congressmen, including House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News Congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, who's been covering this. Scott, welcome. So a subpoena is a clear escalation of an invitation. So clearly the committee believes the testimony of these representatives is crucial. What exactly does the committee hope to learn from them? And aside from Minority Leader McCarthy, who else does the committee want to speak with?
Well, Tanya, this is the high watermark now for this House Select January 6th committee investigation. They have subpoenaed their own Republican colleagues, including the House Republican leader. It is quite a statement. It is quite a provocative thing. The subpoena to Kevin McCarthy says that McCarthy has declined voluntary cooperation with this House committee and that the committee very much wants to speak to him because they say McCarthy spoke to former President Trump before, during, and after the January 6th attack. But McCarthy's not the only one to get a subpoena this afternoon. So too did 4 of his colleagues: Pennsylvania's Scott Perry, Alabama's Mo Brooks, Ohio's Jim Jordan, and Arizona's Andy Biggs. And there's a variety of reasons why those individuals got subpoenas. Let me go through each one with the understanding that there is no voluntary cooperation from any of them. Jim Jordan of Ohio, who is a firebrand member of the House Republican Conference, the leader of the Judiciary Committee for House Republicans, sent text messages to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows in the days before January 6th. We've seen those text messages in court filings by the committee. They want to talk to Jim Jordan, among other things, about what he was saying to the Trump inner circle before the riot began. Then there's Mo Brooks of Alabama. He's the congressman who gave that fiery speech at the White House ellipse about taking down names and firing up the crowd on January 6th, shortly before that crowd arrived. Some of that crowd arrived on Capitol Hill. Then there's Andy Biggs of Arizona. He, according to the committee, was part of the maneuvering and the orchestrations of challenging the Arizona electoral count on January 6th. You may recall that Arizona was the first state to get challenged on the House and Senate floor January 6th. Biggs is believed to be part of those machinations. Then Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, another congressman accused of sending text messages to Mark Meadows ahead of January 6th. In those text messages, according to the committee, Perry was laying the ground for an overhaul, an 11th-hour overhaul inside the Department of Justice after the election before January 6th. The committee has wanted to speak to these men for quite some time, but today took that next striking step, Tanya, and subpoenaed them.
All right, so, Scott, of course, they are members of Congress, working members of Congress. Can these subpoenaed representatives claim executive privilege like some people in the former president's camp have tried to argue?
Well, we're about to find out, but this really is a unique moment where you have a congressional committee issuing a subpoena to members of the same branch of government, to members of the same chamber of Congress. It wouldn't surprise anyone if there's a legal challenge made by these members of Congress against the subpoena and then a legal response by the committee. Very possible, if not likely, this goes through the court system and is a lengthy legal battle, one that may have transcendent impacts for future Congresses and future generations. Can a congressional committee issue a subpoena and effectively use that subpoena against their own colleagues? It's one of the many open-ended questions we're left with now that we've seen 5 members of the House Republican Conference being handed a subpoena by this select committee.
Well, there is so much unprecedented about all of this, including the, insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. So it's not surprising that the investigation continues to have unprecedented elements. Scott, what could this mean for the upcoming midterm elections if these representatives comply and if they don't comply with the subpoenas?
It's going to be more immediate in its impact on the January 6th committee's public hearings before the midterms. Those hearings are set to begin June 9th, a series of 8 or 9 hearings throughout the summer, some of them in prime time. The committee clearly has work it still needs to get done before those hearings begin. They're still issuing subpoenas, including against some high-level members and high-profile members of the House Republican Conference. The I think the more precise way of looking at it is, will those hearings move voters ahead of the midterm elections? Will that shift the electorate? Will that mobilize people? Will that change hearts and minds? We know the committee wants these individuals, these members of Congress, to be part of their hearings, at least the information they can share, to be part of their hearings, which could perhaps shift the electorate. But what we've seen so far is that this committee, its work, and some of the investigation into January 6th has already fallen into predictable and hardened political categories, where you have a number of Republicans, a strong part of the Republican base, calling this a witch hunt and dismissing it out of hand before they even see the final product. You have people supportive of this committee, the House Democratic Caucus, which is starving for these hearings, eager to hear what they produce, and likely to be impacted by it. So it's not clear how many Americans, how many voters can be persuaded on this issue, but the committee believes these 5 congressmen, these 5 Republicans, have valuable information to share that could impact those persuadables.
Scott, though, it's worth reminding our viewers, even though you're right, this has hardened into sort of political divisions, this is a bipartisan committee. There are 2 Republicans on it, even though, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy did not want that to be the case. We are seeing that bear fruit in some ways now.
Yeah, it's a 9-person committee, 7 Democrats, 2 Republicans. It is bipartisan, technically, and by nature. There were some challenges to this committee, including informally by some of the congressmen subpoenaed today, saying it wasn't properly authorized, wasn't properly composed because it doesn't have an equal balance of Democrats and Republicans, and that Mr. McCarthy's choices for this committee, including Jim Jordan, who was subpoenaed today, were blocked by Speaker Pelosi. A court has recently ruled on that, saying the committee is properly authorized, properly composed to go about its business. But I think Speaker Pelosi would argue that one of the reasons she did not want Jim Jordan on the committee, as selected by Kevin McCarthy, is because he's part of the investigation, as is evident today when Jim Jordan was subpoenaed by the Select Committee.
Right. So, Scott, if these representatives who are now subpoenaed do not comply, could they face contempt charges? I mean, I understand that this would be a legal process that would eat up some time, but would that be the natural progression?
We've had a number of witnesses subpoenaed by the January 6th Select Committee who have defied those subpoenas, not sat for depositions, not provided records. And as of today, there is a sum total of 1 who's facing criminal charges for contempt of Congress. That's Steve Bannon, the former White House advisor, former Trump campaign manager. There have been recommendations for prosecutions against others, including former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. The Justice Department has not announced any action on those. This would presumably be a higher bar. These are members of Congress. These are members of the legislative branch. It's necessarily a tricky bit of territory for the courts and for the Justice Department to navigate if they're asked to do so. But this committee wants to at least apply some pressure and use its leverage. And announcing these subpoenas in a press announcement today, part of their effort to use that leverage.
All right, Scott MacFarlane in Washington, thank you for breaking down these unprecedented moves out of Washington today. We appreciate it.